Imagine you're a first time buyer in Melbourne. You open a property website, check the market, and immediately notice one number everywhere: the average house price. At first glance, that number looks extremely high, and it can make home ownership feel almost impossible. But an important question is, does that number actually represent what most buyers face in the market? Or is it being influenced by a small number of very expensive homes? That is the starting point of my analysis. In this project, I use a real Melbourne housing dataset to examine whether the average house price is truly reliable. More specifically, I compare the mean and the median, and I investigate how extreme values, especially the luxury properties, affect the story data tells. The aim is simple: to understand which measure gives a more realistic picture of housing affordability for an ordinary buyer. This is the dataset used for the analysis. It contains 13,580 Melbourne property sales, which gives a strong sample for identifying market patterns. The main variable I focus on is price because that directly reflects market value. But I also use supporting variables such as number of rooms, suburb, and region name. These additional variables are important because they allow me to test whether the same pricing pattern appears across different groups rather than only in the overall market. This helps move the analysis from one general number to a more detailed understanding of how different parts of Melbourne behave. The first step is calculating the two central measure. The mean is the mathematical average, which is all prices added together and divided by total number of sale. However, the median is different. It identifies the middle point of the data, meaning half of the homes are cheaper and half are more expensive. So let's calculate these. Here, the mean is $1,075,684. The median is $903,000. That creates a huge gap of $172,684. Even before any graph, this already suggests that something in the dataset is pulling the mean upward. So, the next question becomes, what exactly is creating that difference? To understand that, I first created a histogram. A histogram helps show how prices are distributed across all observation. On the x-axis, we have the price ranges. On the y-axis, we have the number of properties in each range. The first thing visible is that most properties are concentrated in the lower and middle price categories. As prices rise, the number of properties drop sharply. However, the graph continues far to the right. The long extension is important because it shows positive skewness. This means most homes are not extremely expensive, but a small number of expensive homes stretch the distribution upward. And because the mean uses every value directly, these extreme prices increase the average significantly. So already, this graph tells us that the Melbourne housing market is unevenly distributed. To confirm this, I used a box plot. A box plot is helpful because it shows three significant things: the center of the data, the spread, and outliers. The box itself represents the middle part of the market. The line inside shows the median. Then, above the box, we can see many separate points. These are called outliers. Unusually expensive homes that sit far above normal market values. This explains the gap between mean and median very clearly. The mean gets pulled upward because Each luxury property directly changes the average. The median stays much more stable because it depends only on position, not magnitude. So even if a few houses sell for several millions dollars, the median barely shifts. At this stage, the overall market already shows distortion. But I wanted to test whether this only happens in the full dataset or whether it continues even when we compare similar type of homes. So next, I analyzed the market by room categories. This chart compares mean and median prices for properties with different room counts. The first obvious pattern is that prices increase as room number increases. That is unexpected because larger homes usually sell at higher prices. But more important observation is that in every room category, the mean remains above the median. For one room homes, the difference exists. For two room and three room homes, it becomes clearer. For larger homes, the gap becomes even more visible. This means that even when properties are grouped by size, expensive outliers still influence averages. So, distortion is not only a citywide issue, it also exists inside smaller, compatible categories. To understand where most buyers actually sit, I grouped sales into price bands. This chart shows how transactions are distributed across different price levels. The largest share of sales fall in the middle part, especially between $650,000 and $1.3 million. This is very important because it shows where most real market activity happens. The majority of buyers are not purchasing luxury homes, they're buying in the middle market. That is why median becomes more meaningful. It sits nearly near the most transaction occur. The mean, however, get influenced upward by a relatively small number of high value sales. Next, I compared Melbourne regions. This helps show how distortion changes depending on location. In some regions, the gap between mean and median is large. This suggests stronger luxury market influence. In other regions, the two values are closer together. That suggests fewer extreme sales and a more balanced distribution. This tells us something important. The reliability of average price depends partly on region. When all results are combined, the full picture becomes clear. The mean price is $1,075,684. The median is $903,000. The difference is $172,684. This means the mean is approximately 19.1% higher than the median. A major reason is the luxury segment. Around 679 properties, roughly the top 5%, create much of this effect. These homes have an average close to $2.98 million. The most expensive sale reaches $9 million. So, mathematically, the mean is accurate, but practically, for a normal buyer, it can be misleading. To complete this project, I used Excel throughout the full workflow. First, I reviewed and cleaned the data. Then, I selected the variables most relevant to pricing analysis. After that, I applied average and median formulas. Then, I created a histogram, box plot, room comparison charts, price band charts, and a regional comparison charts. This process helped move from raw numbers to visual evidence. So, is the average house price a lie? Not exactly, but it can definitely create a misleading impression. The mean tells the mathematical story, the median tells the practical buyer story. Because Melbourne contains expensive outliers, the mean rises beyond what most buyers actually experience. That is why median gives a more realistic picture of affordability. And this shows an important lesson in business analytics. Choosing the wrong summary measure can completely change how reality is understood. Thank you.